So this over here is the brand new 4070 from Nvidia. And usually Nvidia cards are a little bit of an interesting, kind of a topic, because a lot of people think that Nvidia is charging their very high-end prices and it's overpriced, very expensive cards. But this one, as a creator, I think is very good news for you. So if you do plan to use this as a creator card or for your creator PC, then there's some good news for you and some not so good news as well. But there's good news about the sponsor of this video.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out Whokeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out whokeys.com in the video description below.
Now, I know I'm a little bit late with this review, but still, I think it's worth talking about, especially when we're talking about price to performance, which we're going to reach in the end of the video as a conclusion. But the good news, first of all, is that these cards are finally a little bit smaller than what we've seen from the 4070 Ti, 4080 and 4090. It's much smaller than them. Feel free to check out my short about the comparison between the 4070 Ti and 4070, but also the power supply requirements are much better. So this card comes with only two 8-pin plugs there, but I've seen some other board partner cards that only have a single 8-pin PCIe cable that goes directly to the card without any converters, which is good news. Let's have a look at the specs of this card, because there's something very interesting here. One of those things, if you do check out online the specs comparison between 4070 and 3070, then you realize that they both have the same amount of CUDA cores. But that's a little bit of misleading information, because this 40 series card runs much faster. The clock speed is much higher, so it's the same as, on a CPU, for example, you've got an 8-core CPU and an 8-core CPU, but one of them runs 6 GHz and one of them 4.5. There's a massive performance increase, for example, for the 6 GHz with the 4.5. So the same with this GPU over here. I'm not going to be comparing this 4070 to the 3070 because it actually performs much better with some of the higher end 30 series there. You'll see some of the 3070 comparisons as well, but I think it's much more accurate with the 3080, which you'll see in a moment. So looking at the specs here, the GPU is an AD104, and as you can see, the 4070 Ti is AD104 as well, which means that Nvidia really didn't have any business naming the 4070 Ti as 4080, because it's really the same 4070, kind of GPU die. As you can see, the 4080 is AD103 die, which has just completely different cores and so on there. So it's a little bit of a bin version from the 4070 Ti. As you can see, the CUDA cores on 4070 Ti, we have about 30% more CUDA cores, still the same process. TMUs, tensor cores and RT cores are all about 30% more on the 4070 Ti. The memory type is GDDR6, and we have 12 GB of VRAM, which is very good news for creators. On 30 series, we had to jump to an RTX 3080 Ti to get 12 GB, but now we have it on a 4070, which is very good. Bear in mind, the 3060 was a little bit of an exception to get 12 GB of VRAM, but it was a much lower end card. The memory bus is 192-bit, and the memory bandwidth is 504.2, which is exactly the same as 4070 Ti. It uses the same PCIe Gen 4 X16 bus interface, and the TDP or GDP is only 200 watts. Now that's the very interesting bit here. When we're comparing it to the 4080, you can see there is quite a big of a gap there. The TDP on the 4080 is 320 watts. We have about 65% more CUDA cores and 16 gigs of VRAM, plus the memory bus is 256-bit. Compared to the 3080, the 3080 has a bit more CUDA cores, TMUs, tensor cores and RT cores, but bear in mind these are previous generation RT cores and tensor cores, which are much better and faster on the new 40 series GPUs. Bear in mind the 3080 also has 10 GB of VRAM, but the memory bus is 320-bit and the memory bandwidth is 760.3 GB per second. Also, the normal TDP is 320 watts, so you can see that we are much more energy efficient in terms of the wattage straight away. We'll talk about that in a moment. In terms of the price, right now, I'm looking at the price new. This has the MSRP of $599, so $600 mark, which is pretty much half the price of 4080. But let's have a look how close we are in terms of the performance of 4080. In terms of 4070 Ti, right now you can pick up cards for 850, maybe used you can get it for 750. And in terms of 3080, a new card you can pick up right now for around $900, which is more expensive than this here. But people would say that you'd be picking up a second-hand card from eBay or something like that for around 550 or 500 bucks. So the used 3080 and new 4070, the price is very, very similar over there. But what about performance? I'm going to leave my Testbench setup in the description below if you want to check out what parts I'm using. But in terms of the power draw and temperatures, what I'm comparing here is the 4070 from Zotac here. We've got the Radeon 7900 XT from ASUS, that's the tough version, which costs $800. So there's about $200 extra that the AMD has. We have the RTX 4070 Ti, that's the ASUS tough version. And then we've got a 3080, and the card I'm comparing here on all of the 3080 benchmarks is the Noctua 3080, which is basically the best version of 3080 you can get. Yeah, Strix you can get that as well, but when I tested the Strix compared to the Noctua one, often the Strix was pulling more wattage, but the Noctua card actually overall performed better in some of the creative benchmarks. So I'm using the Noctua card, which is the fastest 3080 card I've tested in these benchmarks, just to give the best competition to this 4070. The 7900 XT uses 70% more power. The temperature is roughly around the same in terms of the GPU and hotspot, but it's a much bigger card and it's got a much bigger cooler as well. The 4070 Ti is actually slightly warmer, but the hotspot is a little bit lower. And then the 3080 is quite a bit cooler now, but this is because we've got an insane Noctua cooler there, which is very, 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 very good. And we're pulling a lot more power on the Noctua card as well. As you can see, 340 watts compared to 197 watts. So the 197 watts is on Fairmark max utilization. When doing creative benchmarks, I didn't see that 200 mark really push there, not at all. Looking at Geekbench 5, very general GPU test to see where it lands up. The 7900 XT is about 11% slower on the OpenCL, which is interesting. In Vulkan, we are 20% faster, but bear in mind there's a $200 price increase on that AMD card as well. The 4070 Ti is about 18% faster in the CUDA and OpenCL, not so much on the Vulkan score. And then the 3080 is about 9% faster in the CUDA scores because it's got a lot more CUDA scores. The OpenCL is about 7.5% faster because, again, more cores. But in Vulkan, it's slightly slower. So we can see roughly where it lands in terms of the GPU there. This 4070 had the lowest scores that I have recorded on Photoshop. Not in terms of the GPU scores, but in terms of the overall scores. It was lower than the RTX 3050, which looks like a really, really bad, kind of a score and how this worked in Photoshop. But at the same time, I don't think anyone will be paying or buying this card for Photoshop only, because you can see that the 7900 XT, which is one of the fastest cards I have tested for Photoshop, is only 10% faster in the overall scores. And then the likes of 3080 is only 2% faster, and then 4070 Ti is about 4% faster in the overall scores. So yes, in terms of performance in Photoshop, it is a little bit lower. Whatever RTX card you really have for Photoshop, there isn't that much of a difference. So there's an interesting relationship with this card and Photoshop there. I did notice that some of the benchmark scores were really high, but mostly the average is much, much lower. If I'm looking at the very high scores that I got, because there was a bunch of those as well, then these will actually kind of benchmark somewhere around the 3090 Ti and 3090, which is good news really, and shows that this card can perform well, but the average was a bit low. In Lightroom Classic, we're going to skip that benchmark because really the performance increase or decrease is within the margin of error what I have tested so far. Moving on to video editing and Premiere Pro. We've got the same cards here, and the 7900 XT here, very interestingly, is 7 to 10% slower in the standard and extended overall scores. When we're looking at the extended live playback and standard live playback, that's 29 and 28% slower. That's incredibly embarrassing for the AMD card. And that's most likely because of the media engines that Nvidia has in there. Because of the clock speed of the card is very, very fast. the media engines will also kind of work faster, resulting a very good playback performance on this card. In terms of the GPU effects, the 7900 XT is about 3% slower, the 4070 Ti is 3% faster, and the 3080 is about 10% faster. When we're looking at the 4070 Ti, the 4070 Ti is only in about 2% increase over the 4070, which you're not gonna notice, but you're gonna notice the price increase between the 4070 and 4070 Ti. But the 3080 still, interestingly, looks like it's performing better on Premiere Pro if we're not looking at the standard overall score and the live playback, which is quite a bit better on the 40 series card. As you can see, 7% and 12% slower on the 3080. Moving over to After Effects, the 7900 XT is only 2% faster in the overall scores, the same about 4070 Ti, about 2.4% faster, and the 3080 about 3.4% faster. Again, we're really not utilizing the GPU so much here in After Effects, and we're much more RAM and CPU bottlenecked there. Moving on to DaVinci Resolve, which shows a lot more GPU usage, and let's have a look at the differences here. The 7900 XT is about 3% faster in the extended overall score and about 7% in the standard overall score. Interestingly, the GPU effects here are 31% faster on the AMD card, which is a lot faster. But the 8K media score, for some reason, is much faster on the 4070. In fact, it's faster than the 4070 Ti and a 3090. Now, you can see here that I don't have a 3080 card here because the 3080 benchmark was with an older version of DaVinci Resolve, which actually performs much lower, and because I don't have it at hand, I put in an RTX 3090. That's the Asus TUF RTX 3090, which is more than double the price of this card, but is only 5.6% faster in the extended overall scores and only 7.2% faster in the standard overall scores. Obviously, the GPU effects are much faster on the 3090 because double the amount of VRAM, but regardless, everything considered, I think this card performs very well for DaVinci Resolve. Now, video editing and photo editing aside, let's look at 3D, where we see the best news about this card. And that's why 40 series are amazing. First of all, looking at V-Ray here, and there's no point of putting the AMD cards here because AMD cards don't support V-Ray, so I'm putting in the RTX 3070 here, and that's the Zotac Twin Edge. We can see that that is 22% slower in the CUDA scores and about 30% slower in the RTX scores. That's insane. The 4070 Ti obviously is 27% faster in the CUDA scores and 25% faster in the RTX scores, so there is a marginal increase, and kind of the price increase makes sense between the 4070 and 4070 Ti. In terms of the 3080, that card has much more CUDA scores. Even though it having much more CUDA scores, we are still 4% slower and 7.6% slower in the RTX scores. So the 4070 here kind of makes sense. Moving on to Blender. First of all, looking at the AMD card versus 4070, the 7900 XT is 50% slower in the monster scene, 46% slower in the junk shop scene, and 50.6% slower in the classroom scene. That's insane performance increase over the AMD card. The 4070 Ti is 11 to 22% faster in the monster, junk shop, and classroom scenes. So again, measurable increase over the 4070, but the 3080 here is 12 to 25% slower in the monster, junk shop, and classroom scenes, which just shows that the newer architecture, faster clock speeds really do matter with the 40 series, especially when you're doing 3D. But let's look at the Blender second benchmark set here that I've compared with the RTX 3090, 3090 Ti, and the best card that AMD has come up with, the 7900 XTX. 3090 is 10% slower in the monster scene, about 4.6% faster in the junk shop scene, but about 9% slower in the classroom scene. That's impressive. Now, the 3090 Ti, that's about 2.5 times the MSRP of this card, is 4.7% slower in the monster scene, 12% faster in the junk shop scene, but 5.7% slower in the classroom scene. Never mind the 7900 XTX, which is 37 to 42% slower than the 4070 here. If I would have been Nvidia, I would have advertised this in the marketing. 3090 Ti is actually slower in Blender 3D than this 4070, which is ridiculous. Now, I understand that as a 3D creator, you might still want to go with a 3090 Ti than this one because of the double the VRAM situation, and perhaps at that point maybe even a 3090 if you're looking for the cheaper used cards. But regardless, this card has still some ridiculous 3D performance in its sleeve. In Octanebench, obviously AMD cards aren't supported. The RTX 3090, which is the Asus TUF version, is 1.6% slower. The 4070 Ti is about 6.5% faster, and the RTX 3070 is about 38% slower. I don't have a 3080 benchmark for this Octanebench, but knowing that even the 3090 is slower than this 4070, we can expect it to perform about 15 to 20% slower than the 4070. So now, in conclusion, is this card worth it? And when you're looking at the performance and the price you pay for it, plus what else you can get on the market right now, it makes a ton of sense for people who are doing 3D content creation, for example. If you're working in Blender, V-Ray, Octanebench, or something like that, we've got the great studio drivers from Nvidia and insane performance for that. It's small card, it runs very quiet, very power efficient, only 200 watts, which is a lot less than some of the competition that we were comparing this with, especially when we're looking at the 7900 XTX from AMD, which is pretty much double the price, but still performs slower in 3D. This makes a ton of sense. Plus, we've got AV1 encoding, 2 of the media engines. Bear in mind, this one has the same media engines inside than the 4090, which is just insane, and all that jazz. Then everything considered, I think this is a really good card for content creators. If you're looking to get 12 gigabytes of VRAM, this is the new cheapest card and performs very well. I'm actually very positive about this 4070, and I'm probably, if I can, upgrading my personal rig there that uses a 20 series card to the 4070, because then I can live stream to AV1, which means I'm gonna save on my internet bandwidth and I'm gonna get much better picture quality when streaming. And if you're doing the same, perhaps content creation or something like that, this card is a really nice card to have, especially this Zotac one as well, that is fairly small. If you want to check it out, I'm going to leave it in the description below. But also, if you want to build yourself the best bang for buck creator PC, check out the build guides in there. Whatever your budget is, there's a video down there where you can pick the budget, do the upgrades or downgrades, configure it to your needs. I'm going to explain it all there. Build guides, everything's explained there. Check it out in the video description below. Thanks guys for watching, and bye bye. But this good news. Flipping heck. Hello?